Now, welcome back. For the first time in history, South Africa holds the presidency of the Group of 20, a position that South Africa assumed the presidency of at a time of escalating geopolitical tension and growing economic disparities between the developed and developing nations. Now, the country intends to use its presidency to influence global agendas on trade, climate action, and, of course, food security, among others. The G20 comprises 19 of the world's most systematic important countries and also includes the African Union and the European Union. Now, as South Africa assumed the G20 presidency on December the 1st last year and will host the G20 Leaders Summit in November this year. And since South Africa took over as president of the G20 in December 2024, a number of key meetings have already been held. South Africa's presidency is being held under the theme Solidarity, Equality, Sustainability, and with a strong focus on Africa's holistic development. Now, to give us a status update on how South Africa's presidency is progressing and what some of the dominant issues may be and how the country is preparing itself to host the Leaders Summit, we joined virtually now by South Africa's G20 Sous Sherpa, Ambassador Xolisa Mabongo. Ambassador Mabongo, thanks for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning to your viewers.
And perhaps a good place to start would be just to remind ourselves of South Africa's priorities as the G20 president for 2025.
So, as you indicated, we took over the presidency of the G20 on 1 December 2024. And in presenting our G20 presidency, President Ramaphosa highlighted 4 key areas. That is, firstly, disaster risk resilience, focusing on climate change in particular. Secondly, debt sustainability, addressing the problem of debt sustainability for low-income countries. As you know, many countries pay more to service their debt than they do spend on social issues such as education, health, and other important critical areas. So debt sustainability is very important for our G20 presidency. As you know, this year alone, in 2025, the African continent will pay about $89 billion on debt servicing alone, and about 22 countries from the continent are at the risk of debt distress. So we have got to address this. Secondly, there is the issue of the financing of the just energy transitions. As you know, South Africa was one of the countries that pioneered the concept of just energy transition. So we want to use our G20 presidency, therefore, to mobilize resources for funding the just energy transition in the developing countries of the South. The last priority is critical minerals. Here again, as you know, there is a big scramble in the world for critical minerals to finance the transition to new technologies. So South Africa has therefore placed this at the center of our G20 presidency. But over and above these 4 high-level priorities, we are also focusing on food security, on artificial intelligence, on gender equality and women's empowerment, and of course, the overarching problem of climate change. So in a nutshell, those are some of the priorities that we are pursuing through our G20 presidency.
Let's pick up on a few of those, like the debt relief, for example. In terms of advocacy, what would South Africa focus on just in terms of looking at restructuring, perhaps, for African countries in particular struggling to service their debt?
So we are looking at a 2-pronged approach. Firstly, there are already mechanisms that are existing in the international community through the World Bank, the IMF. The G20 itself has got a program called the Common Framework that is aimed at helping countries manage their debt in a sustainable way. So we're saying, first of all, it is important that we reform the existing mechanisms, make them more agile, make them more accessible to more countries that require debt relief. So far, for example, the common framework of the G20 is very difficult to access, very complex, and it takes a long time for a country to actually qualify and have results from it. So this is an example of an existing mechanism that needs to be improved. But secondly, we're looking at long-term solutions what are the long-term solutions that we can come up with to deal with the debt. So those are the sort of the two areas of focus that we are going to be utilizing and working together with other G20 countries to mobilize support for long-term solutions.
What about pushing for the restructuring and reform of institutions such as the Bretton Woods institutions in order to help facilitate with, as you say, the managing, but one would imagine also the restructuring of debt for these countries?
The reform of the international financial architecture, including the World Bank, the IMF, and the multilateral development institutions, is a central part of our work as in the G20. And South Africa will be continuing with this work. This is a work that was amplified under the previous presidencies of Indonesia, India, and Brazil. So we have got this unique opportunity of having 4 countries of the South holding the presidency of the G20 consecutively. So we are working together and with other G20 members to ensure that we also put a spotlight on the need to reform the international financial architecture, the World Bank, the IMF, and the rest of the multilateral development institutions.
When it comes to trade, as an example, what is South Africa's vision in terms of pushing for fairer trade, especially for developing nations?
This is a very important question because what we are witnessing in the world now is actually a dwindling of resources. That is the official development assistance on which developing countries depended for many years is dwindling. The priorities of some of the donor countries have changed because of the rapidly changing geopolitical environment. Therefore, trade becomes important. Trade is important because we've got to generate our own domestic resources for our development as countries of the South, and trade is central to that. So as part of our G20 presidency, we are also pushing for the reform of the World Trade Organization and the broader multilateral trading system. So this is very important for us. Also, we are also using our G20 presidency to provide support to the African Continental Free Trade Area, which would be a game changer for the continent if it was fully implemented. So yes, trade is very important for us. We see it as a good source of domestic resources that we need for our development, especially in the context where official development assistance from the countries of the North is dwindling.
And to that point, how important is the strengthening of further South-South cooperation for South Africa to foster during this time?
South-South cooperation has been a pertinent area and a priority for South Africa's foreign policy. In any case, even before we took over the G20 presidency. So we are working already in a number of projects. For example, South Africa, India, and Brazil have got what we call the IPSA initiative, where we are promoting South-South cooperation amongst ourselves, but also extending support as the 3 countries, extending support to other countries in the African continent, in Latin America, and in Asia for their development projects. So, for example, the IPSA fund, we call it the IPSA fund, the India, Brazil, South Africa fund. So we contribute to this fund as the 3 countries, and then we use it to support development projects in countries in Africa, in Asia, and also in Latin America. So this is an example of that shows that South-South cooperation has always been part of South Africa's foreign policy.
And what practical steps does South Africa look to take in order to further strengthen not just the South-South voices, but also to amplify African voices to make sure that that agenda is heard and further strengthened, especially on areas such as trade, such as climate action and the rest?
So we are in a very unique moment at this stage because the African Union as an organization was admitted in 2023 as a full member of the G20. It's similar to the European Union. So the AU and the EU are both full members of the G20. So South Africa is therefore working closely with the African Union. Before, we were the only country that was from the continent that was a member of the G20. So we're now working very closely with the AU to make sure that we amplify the voice of the continent. So if you look at our priorities and the priorities that have been set by the African Union for its participation in the G20, there are synergies and very big complementarities. So in a sense, we are pursuing the same priorities. And this is not surprising because we've got our own continental program called the Agenda 2063. So the South African priorities and those of the AU are complementary in the sense that they are based on the pursuit of Agenda 2063. That is the one way in which we're amplifying the voice, working closely with the AU, ensuring that we pursue joint priorities in the G20 context. But secondly, what we have done in our G20 presidency is to invite other countries. Remember, a G20 president has got the opportunity to invite additional countries to participate in its presidency beyond just the members of the G20. So what we have then done was to invite other countries from the continent to take part fully in our G20 presidency, countries such as Ethiopia, Egypt, Nigeria. And that, again, is aimed at amplifying the voice of the continent, ensuring that it is heard. During the foreign ministers' meeting of the G20 that was held in Johannesburg in February, this came out very clear in the outcome document that the G20 members are committed to hearing more from and hearing an amplified African voice.
And ultimately, Ambassador Mabongo, the question has to be, how will South Africa's presidency of the G20 benefit ordinary South Africans? Or put differently, perhaps, how will South Africa ensure that this G20 presidency actually benefits ordinary South Africans?
So again, if you go back to our priorities, you will see that our priorities are also informed by what is the agenda of the current 7th administration in South Africa. So when we were crafting the priorities, we looked at what is it, because it's important for us that the G20 resonates with the people of South Africa so that they can see their challenges in what the G20 does. And that is what exactly we did. So we looked at the three main overarching priorities of the 7th administration and made sure that our full agenda is therefore informed by those, in addition to the other factors that I mentioned. So that is the first point. The second point is that the G20 by its nature is aimed at promoting a global coordination on key progressive policies. So to the fact that we can integrate the priorities of our own administration in our work as the G20 president, that in itself should result in a favorable international environment, because the point about the G20 is really to create a favorable international environment so that we can then, countries like South Africa, be able to pursue their priorities and their needs in that favorable international environment. So by placing our priorities, therefore, in our presidency of the G20, this is the synergy that we are trying to create. That is the first point. The second point is that the G20, what we are doing in South Africa, we are calling it a People's G20. So we've ensured that the G20 reaches all the parts of our country. Remember, our calendar has got about 132 meetings that will be held during this year. And we're ensuring that all these meetings are held in all the provinces and all the corners of South Africa.
And of course, I think many South Africans looking forward to actually benefit from this, making sure, as you said, maximizing the economic benefits and spreading it across the country. Your final message, Ambassador? How do you want South Africans to receive this presidency of the G20?
I think the good news that we can tell is so far, since we started in December, is that in the G20, there is a broad and overwhelming support for the priorities that we have set. In all the meetings that we've held so far, out of the 132 meetings, we've held about 32 so far, and covering all the tracks of the G20. And the message that we are getting is that our priorities are well accepted by the international community, by the members of the G20. And what we would want to see, therefore, is South Africans also rallying around and supporting this effort of the G20. As I said, in all different manifestations, when we host meetings in different provinces, it is important that South Africans come out and as a collective, as a nation, we put our best foot forward.
Ambassador Mabongo, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much. Ambassador Xolisa Mabongo, South Africa's G20 Sous Sherpa, giving us an update on how South Africa's G20 presidency is progressing.